We're going to get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Cornelius Chats 3x3. My name is Michael Magnuson. I'm the Public Program and Outreach Coordinator at the Art Gallery of Alberta. To start this program, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. The AGA is in Treaty Territory 6 in Edmonton, the traditional lands of diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Inuit, and Ojibwe Saulteaux Anishinaabe. We acknowledge and extend gratitude to the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for generations and who continue to call this place home today. This event is part of Cornelius Chats 3x3, 3 digital chats from 3 Canadian cities, part of the public program for Cornelia Han Oberlander Genius Loci at the Art Gallery of Alberta. This discussion explores new ways of thinking about the role of landscape architecture in the future of our urban environment. 3x3 builds reference from Cornelia's childhood, where she tended her own small 3-foot by 3-foot garden of carrots and peas. Before we get started, I would like to mention that I will be moderating the chat. So if you have any questions for our Q&A, please write them in the Q&A function, and we will try to answer them at the end. If you are visiting us from Facebook land, please use the chat function for your questions. Okay, so this AGA Live is made possible in part through support from the Heart and Soul Fund by Expo. I would also like to thank the Canada Council for the Arts for their support as well for this program. Now I will bring on curator of the exhibition, Amory Cavelli, to introduce our 2 speakers.
Hello, and nice to be here. Hello, everyone. I'm Amory Cavelli. And I've been asked to give just a brief little bit about Cornelia before we start today. So I thought I would start by mentioning that Cornelia Han Oberlander had a career spanning 7 decades. She has worked with many architects, including Canadian architects Arthur Erickson and Moshe Safdie. She was the recipient of the Order of Canada and the highest award from both the American Society of Landscape Architects and the International Federation of Landscape Architects. This year, an International Landscape Prize has been named in her name. Today's chat is about exploring the depth of Cornelia's work and the perspective of those who have collaborated with her. We'll hear about design for the places of care and of memory. We'll hear particularly about a hospital and a cemetery. First, I've been asked to give just a little bit more background about Cornelia's work, so I will start with 4 images that really give just quite a snippet of her career. This first part of the work is the Creative Play Center for Expo 67, and this project was really about raising awareness for spontaneous play at an international scale. This is the time when Cornelia started incorporating loose parts, building materials and loose parts for kids to play with. There was rocking in a small Nova Scotia dory on a stream. So there are very different activities that were incorporated into this play. Next slide is the Northwest Territories Legislative Building. And this was a project that was completed in Yellowknife in 1995. And Cornelia collaborated with Matsusaki and Wright Pin Matthews and worked specifically with Eva Matsusaki to design the landscape. One of the concepts that's often mentioned from this project is invisible mending, which is adding native species or grasses and restoring the wetlands, just piecemeal, adding particular native grasses so that it looks almost as if nothing was done. Next slide is the Vancouver Public Library roof. And this project that is in the exhibition has 2 parts. There's 1992 to 95, working with Moshe Safdie Architects, and in addition in 2018. This project also is with Downs, Archambault, and Partners. And the 2 rooftop gardens, one is public and one is private, can be seen today, and is an example of many rooftop gardens that Cornelia has done. And the last slide is back at 1954 with Mill Creek Public Housing. And this was a project where Cornelia worked with associate Dan Kiley on a public housing project. It was about 218 units, and it was designed by Louis Kahn's firm. So Cornelia, one of the things that she focused on with this project was equally allotting trees and green spaces to each ground floor unit. And she always had attention to that sort of detail with access and equity of access. So now we're going to talk about where we picked up from where Cornelia left off. And the conversation today is about landscape in the service of care. From the hospital to the cemetery, we're going to hear about an approach to landscape design that considers cognitive and emotional healing and that creates connections to memory through design. I'll introduce our two speakers that we have today, and they will each present a couple of slides as well. We will then go into a short Q&A, and I'll ask a couple of questions to start, and then we'll have the Q&A open for all of your questions as well. So I'll begin with Bill Peckett, who received degrees in geography and visual arts from the University of Victoria, followed by a professional degree in architecture in 1987 from the UBC. The Vancouver-based Peckett Studio has combined an interest in art, architecture, and urban infrastructure, and has created over 30 years of projects that include public art, playgrounds, plazas, cemeteries, and memorials, public infrastructure, lighting, street furnishings, interiors, exhibitions, stage sets, and houses. He and his collaborators have been committed to the idea that spaces must offer multiple layers of experimental encounter by uncovering their sensorial, spatial, social, ritualistic, and environmental potentials in order to contribute positively to the communities they serve. His projects have been represented internationally. The studio has received awards from the Canada Council and the American and Canadian Societies of Landscape Architecture, the Province of British Columbia, and the AIBC. In 2006, under the banner of Peckett and Robb Art and Architecture, he and Stephanie Robb represented Canada at the 2006 Venice Biennial in Architecture with their Sweater Lodge project. Recently, the studio has completed 2 cemetery projects in the US, concept designs for a suspending lighting system for a street in Vancouver, a series of small urban spaces in Vancouver, 3 large public art projects in Western Canada, a large memorial community space in Calgary. A current project just west of Toronto involves working with a team of biologists, hydrologists, and landscape architects towards the remediation of fish habitat that runs adjacent to the Arts Centre. Bill is a faculty member at the University of British Columbia School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture since 2000, with a research focus on material culture and urban futures. He is a frequent lecturer on the built environment and the critical role that public space can play in the development of healthy and vibrant cities. Please welcome Bill Peckett.
Thank you, Amory, and hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to be invited to speak to you about my experiences working with Cornelia Oberlander and how working with her influenced the direction of many parts of my life. Next slide, please. Cornelia and I have, of her 70 decades of work that Amory referred to, I had the pleasure of working on 30 of those years, or 3 decades. We worked on 4 projects together, and each one of them, which I encountered at different stages of my life, provided 4 fundamental lessons for me. And I know that this sounds pat and highly structured, but reflecting on my experience with her, I thought it would be a nice way to explain the role that she played in my thinking and how it influenced the direction of many of my projects, even the ones that we didn't work on together. Next, please. My first encounter with Cornelia was when I was a fledgling architect in the office of Henricus and Partners here in Vancouver. I had just really recently come out of architecture school, and I was working on the Trent University Environmental Sciences building. I heard Cornelia before I saw her because she burst into the office and announced to everybody that she was so pleased to be here, but that she was going to insist that we set the bar very high in terms of the environmental experience, the landscape interface of this project. And I sat in a meeting with her and Richard Henricus and a few others, and I listened to the incredible synergy that she had with Richard in conceptualizing the relationship between the landscape and ecology and this building. From that was my first lesson, because I hadn't really been exposed until that point to the kind of amazing, robust conversations that people from aligned disciplines can have in terms of solving problems. Next, please. A few years later, I maintained my own studio, and I was working away on a number of small play and kind of sculptural works that were extrapolations from a thesis that I had done when I graduated from architecture school, called the Museum of Sand. All of them in some way were meant to elicit a kind of a playful response to the person who encountered these objects in miniature environments. Cornelia saw these. Next, please. Cornelia saw these, and she asked me to collaborate with her on a playground for the Talmatora Day School here in Vancouver. As Emery discussed, Cornelia was incredibly dedicated to the idea that children have to be nurtured in all their cerebral and haptic ways, to produce a kind of healthy society of risk takers, but also just the simple joy of play being integral to children's education. And so with Cornelia, I ended up designing these play tables that would be installed in the playground. Next, please. Each table had a kind of, they were cast from concrete and had a very open-ended idea of what could happen on them. So in a sense, they were not directive in terms of asking the students to encounter them in a specific way, but rather they gave structure for a variety of invention that the students could do. So there was like a gridded one that they could play a version of checkers on. There were holes that were in a grid. There was a big indentation of a circle. There were 2 mountain ranges that sand and all kinds of stuff could be piled on top of. And then there was something that we just got the biggest giggle out of called lunchtime fun, that was an embossing of 2 negatives of lunches. Next, please. Cornelia also wanted, in the playground she was designing was highly topographic. By that I mean there were a lot of undulations, and she wanted the children to be able to not just encounter flat space, but also to be encouraged to use various parts of their bodies in fun and special ways. And so she asked me to design this bridge element as well out of concrete that had a kind of an impossible curve to it that she thought that the kids would really enjoy encountering. A more tame version of this was eventually built, but this is where she was headed at the beginning of it. Next, please. The resultant tables and environments, which included like a cast concrete hat that was pinned to a rock, a variety of sand play elements, and these tables gave the kids a chance to invent games, to socialize with each other, to challenge their minds, and then through her landscape, also the body. Next, please. Many years later, actually 17 years later, to be honest, we collaborated again on a cemetery project at Mountain View Cemetery in Vancouver, in the area you see in this slide, which is the red rectangle, which was the original Jewish cemetery for Vancouver. It's part of a patchwork of many different cultures who occupy this mammoth, very large municipal cemetery. Next, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is a cemetery that for a variety of reasons has been slowly disappearing into the landscape. And the Jewish section, which you see in this slide, was slowly sinking into the ground. And we were losing a lot of valuable surface information, grave markers, and also the original pathway system that was used to divide the landscape. Next, please. If you looked at this cemetery when we encountered it, you would have thought that it was maybe just a third full, because there was so much missing information that the grass and the land had started to gobble up. Next, please. As well, perimeter hedge was actually rather poetically starting to eat up the perimeter tombstones as well. But in any case, Cornelia and I, and the office that the small office I was now running, next please, started to do a number of studies on the cemetery. Oh, here's another slide of the grave markers that are disappearing into the hedge. Next, please. Cornelia and my little team started to do exploratory excavations, and what we realized is just lurking below the surface was a whole host of kind of information. For example, this was a curb that defined a pathway at one time. Next, please. We felt like we used to talk on the phone, and we felt like we were on an archaeological dig. Anyways, between the two of us, we came up with a strategy to slowly peel away very carefully the top layer of this landscape. And what it revealed was a whole network of pathways and family and curbing that had family names in it, and also monuments that had been lost for many, many years, maybe several decades. Next, please. And this is in the middle of our process. This is what we started to understand. Next, please. And looking at old historic photos of the site, we realized that not only was it this part of the cemetery, but other parts of the cemetery that had the same fate. Next, please. So once we had excavated and we knew where all the curbing was, we made maps. And like I said, we used to talk on the phone and pretend that we were archaeologists. And it was a very exciting process to be sharing with her. By the way, at this point, she was 95 years old. I wanted to mention that, but was as energetic as ever. But the interesting thing about Cornelia, next slide, and this is my next lesson. My next lesson was that there have to be rules. Cornelia understood that society, spaces, ecology, all levels of systems obeyed a kind of rule set. And even though she was also an artistic master or mistress, whatever one says now, she said, we have to apply these rules. And of course, Bill, you know the International Charter for the Conservation and Restoration of Monuments and Sites that was written in 1964 in Venice. And we said, no, Cornelia, I don't know that. Please teach me. Next, please. She said, well, now that we have our map and we know what's missing, because many curbs were missing, she said, now we have to, and brings me to the next slide, we have to apply these rules. And the rest, and she cited Article 9, which I'll just read. The process of restoration is a highly specialized operation. Its aim is to preserve and reveal the aesthetic and historic value of the monument, and is based on respect for the original material and authentic documents. It must stop at the point where conjecture begins, and in this case, moreover, any extra work, and this is critical, which is indispensable, must be distinct from the architectural composition and must bear a contemporary stamp. The restoration in any case must be preceded and followed by an archaeological and historical study of the monument. Next, please. She said to me, and on the sidelines, the committee that had hired us really wanted a very historicist restoration, which we understood, but there were some new elements that were being added. And they also wanted those to appear as if they were from 1887. Cornelia and I became strong allies in the idea that we had to make a distinction between what was an original landscape and or set of built elements and what was new. And also that we had to allow for improvisation and for poetry to emerge from the project. And she loved the way that the hedge and the grave markers were starting to have this kind of dance with one another. So we made a pact. Next, please. The resultant restoration included a new entry court where we reconstructed a gate that we could only find in one photograph. The language of this was trying to tread easily between the historic and the found. Next, please. In our new entry court, we introduced a number of elements that were clearly distinct from the original cemetery that also provided spaces for people to gather in a 21st century way that the cemetery originally didn't really require. Next, please. And this is what this started to look like. Next, please. But Cornelia really, because of her rule set and her clear understanding of structure, allowed us to become also inventors. These were some benches that were attached to the wall that were clearly a language that was from now. She gave us permission to do that. Next, please. And to create water catching basins out of bronze that were incredibly beautiful and related to ritualistic requirements of the Jewish community. Next, please. And this is what the resultant cemetery looks like today. Next, please. This is us at the opening. We were very happy. Next, please. The final project that I've been working on with Cornelia is sadly one where she's no longer with us. It's a cemetery that she designed many decades ago in White Rock, British Columbia, as well for a Jewish community called Temple Shalom. And I've been hired, or my little firm here has been hired to insert an open air funeral pavilion for ceremonies to take place, a memorial grove to remember people who aren't buried here, and a washroom facility and storage. Next, please. My lesson from Cornelia on this is that because this is an exceptional cemetery, the part of the drawing in the lower half of this image is what she originally designed. And you can see that the grave sites were not sited on a regularized grid. She decided to locate them in these fan-shaped pathways that set up a very, very beautiful lyrical dance with the forested condition. Moreover, she designed it in such a way that she could preserve as many trees as possible. And when she spoke to me about this cemetery, she said that our role is to set up relationships with nature, where culture and nature are in a beautiful dance with one another. Next, please. And so our addition will be in the same vein as what Cornelia set up. Here are some beautiful images of what this cemetery looks like now. You can see the arcing shapes of the pathways. Next, please. This is the final image. What I want to leave us with is the idea that how we design spaces, the stories that we tell about them, the ethics that are behind them, the environmental and aesthetic goals of them are not static, particularly in the realm of landscape architecture. I should mention I'm not a landscape architect, but I have a great affinity for it. And that Cornelia's influence in these 4 projects of working with her in this ongoing one have given me a framework and an affirmation that play is important, environmental stewardship is important, aesthetics are important, that all these things are wrapped up in a giant bundle together. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. That was a great presentation of the 4 projects in the cemeteries and bundling it all up together at the end. I'd like to invite Jane Faraby to turn her camera on now. And just a note that when I first started talking with Jane, what the idea behind this discussion is about exploring Cornelia's approach. And so Jane is going to share a bit of that with us. Jane Faraby has been active in the field of architecture for 36 years, with 25 of those in private practice, while the balance have been as the university architect for the University of Calgary. For almost 2 decades in Alberta, Jane has been actively involved with the Alberta Association of Architects, including as president in 2004 and 2005. Since then, she has been deeply involved in the development of the National Registration Exam for Architectural Interns. Her passion for good design plays out in her advocacy work, paid and volunteer. Most recently, her work with the group of Indigenous elders in the shared development of a campus landscape plan has been a highlight. Please welcome Jane Faraby.
Hello, everyone, and thank you to everyone at AGA, led by Amory, for inviting me to take part in this conversation. With my talk, we'll move through some context, a description of the work Cornelia and I did that was unrealized, but nonetheless just as powerful an experience, a brief background on healing landscapes in hospital settings, and finally a description, more verbal with a few images, about the Alberta Children's Hospital work that we did do together, the vision. So, for context, and may I have the first slide, please? Undoubtedly, Cornelia's belief in the value of creative play, her fascination with the role of healing spaces in the restoration of people's spirits, and her curiosity about Calgary's wind-torn setting, see pictures, led her to consider the offer of a role on the Alberta Children's Hospital project early in its development. Next, please. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, we were seeing an increased interest in healing gardens, particularly in hospital settings. Cornelia was intrigued with the concept of a healing landscape, and this project, the ACH project, would allow us to further explore the concept she so admired from Doug Reed's 1998 Wellesley, Massachusetts Hospital Garden and the San Diego, more playful Children's Hospital Gardens. We amassed articles on others and planned a trip to visit several in support of the research. I was newly at Keynesian architecture, couldn't be coaxed to work on the architecture of the recently awarded hospital project, but was ecstatic to be asked to work with Cornelia on the early design of the site as the building's concept began to take shape. My role was to translate the evolving hospital design to Cornelia so that the land and the proposed building could be considered together. I was the go-between, I was the mentee, and Cornelia's accomplice in this new adventure. Next slide, please. The site was a large rectangle in the very bare and undeveloped University of Calgary's West Campus land. It was tipped slightly to set up a view to the west, down the Bow River Valley towards the Rocky Mountains. The architectural team were determined to frame this view with a large expanse of glass on the west side of the public area of the hospital. Next slide, please. the belly of the small person that the plan was beginning to emulate. You can see the plan of the hospital there with its head and arms and legs and tummy. Next slide, please. Correspondence between us traveled by fax, and we talked a lot. She came to the Calgary site so that we could walk it, study the wild grasses, and take clippings. Next slide, please. From the knotted trees tied into woven shrubs in the soon-to-be demolished and overgrown University Arboretum, I sent her sketches describing the evolving hospital wings, and we pulled plant lists, next slide, from local nurseries. We laterally spent days together in Vancouver playing with ideas, drawings, and visiting sites. The work was captured in my notes that Amory found 20 years later, this past summer, in the Canadian Centre for Architecture. Cornelia had so many questions, and we enjoyed making lists of things to research. Both of curious dispositions, we'd compare notes on our findings with every call. It was vigorous, she moved fast, and I loved it. There was no time to waste. Next slide, please. Her starting point was, as many have noted already, very thorough research. Collect all that can be found, see all that can be visited. Speak to all those who will be involved, uncover the story of the place and its hydrology, its plant life, its wildlife, its past lives. Really understand the role that the outside places are going to play in the overall design. How will they be used? How can they support vibrant learning? How can they support community, grieving, delight, compassion? Her goal, thankfully, also, next please, was to instruct. And I'm one of many lucky enough to have been instructed. Here's a quote from Mark Epstein. Next, please. In an article he wrote in 1998, entitled The Garden Healer. Quote, people relate to plants. That's the basis of therapeutic landscape design and horticultural therapy. This was published in the Seattle publication, one of our many reference points. Claire Cooper Marcus's book, Healing Gardens, quickly became a resource for us as it had been published just a year or two before we began our work. A professor at Berkeley, Cooper Marcus had gone on to write much more on the subject since then. Cornelia had so many questions about the program of the future hospital. Who would lead them? Who would lead the programs? And what would be their greatest needs? The importance of programming was well understood by Cornelia. We sought access to teachers, to program directors, to volunteers, to patients, to parents. Listening engagement were going to be extremely important to make this landscape rich with learning opportunities. Next slide. She also sought the advice of experts. And because the Vancouver General Hospital Burn Unit Healing Garden was under construction at the time, we had lunch with Dr. Leonard George, the director of psychology at VGH. Dr. George spoke to us about the value of real engagement with staff and patients, which Cornelia clearly understood anyhow. He also, though, spoke about the value of distraction, that is, creative distraction, to the healing process. The importance of understanding symbols and aesthetics that have meaning to the most number of patients and their families. He encouraged the use of a horticultural therapist in the design of such spaces. Next, please. I learned, as Cornelia spoke about the power of plants, of not only their aesthetic, but also their temporal and their spiritual qualities. Plants are seasonal, persistently returning next season and the next season. In a healing environment, they provide a respite to the chaos that comes with illness or trauma. By way of background, then, the medieval hospices built into the monasteries were the first Western restorative gardens, places of calm and places of comfort. Through time, more hospitals have had gardens in recognition of this value, the value of convalescence for body and soul. Of course, with 20th century advances in both medical science and building construction, hospitals have become massive complexes where saving travel distance for medical professionals has become more the focus than the nebulous business of healing. Next slide, please. Post-World War II saw horticultural therapy programs advance for work with veterans and with the elderly. Since then, we have begun to see, over the last 20 years, design guidelines that have emerged for healthcare gardens. Guidelines that advise on color, seasonal plants, trees where the leaves move, pollinator plants, plants that offer sensory stimulation opportunities, including sound and smell and touch. So in Vancouver, a little later in our few-month experience, we began working on the massive Alberta Children's Hospital site. Next slide. I'm going to go around it from the northeast corner, which is actually the emergency department. And I'm going to go counterclockwise. I'll tell you a little bit about our vision. The enclosure of the North Gardens was going to be important for privacy and security and to manage pathogens, but was also required to create quiet and to help as a windbreak from our northwest winds. Enclosed areas would be contrasted with open walks. Next slide, please. Following a winding Jeffersonian wall of brick and block. The north side would have a string of gardens with a variety of experiences along their length. The pathways swelling and narrowing as the spaces were encountered. An important but little known aspect of this area would be the grieving garden, made up of smaller spaces with seating and hedges for privacy. Areas for families to slip into from the door of the nearby intensive care areas with their dying child. There they would find water, soft plantings, seating, and a full view of the sky. Next, please. The sculpture garden would be designed tight to the inpatient unit spaces, drawing views out of the building and enticing staff and families to explore, supporting sightlines to future art, engaging the senses, and marking the change of seasons for those spending long periods of time in the hospital. The color garden then, next please, would be planted with a variety of planting, paving, lighting, and it would have a screen that would capture snow and ice so that those inside could watch the play of light. This area would make use of mountain ash trees that sport those bright red berries and hawthorn trees that turn color through the seasons. Birdhouses would be, next slide please, birdhouses would be placed near the windows and the benches, suspended from trees, visible to those inside the windows. The Discovery Garden, facing west, would be more active and allow families and staff to watch the sunset. The garden would encourage systematic, sensory, physical, and emotional healing of children, with gentle terracing to support a child's climb each day to a new level. Drawing on the Children's Creative Center at Montreal's Expo 67, Cornelia imagined mounds, a tree house, a water course, a shipwreck boat jumping and exploring opportunities and loose pieces. Next, please. A rest garden with fragrant plants and shaded benching would allow peaceful respite. Next, please. From the busier parts of the site, staff would be screened with climbing vegetation. Dappled light through aspen growths would offer an alternative to the sterility of the inpatient unit rooms. As far as a massive sweep of land down the west side of the site facing the river valley, we talked about a grid of aspen trees among the parked cars. Next, please. That would continue their linear march with crabapple trees, making up an orchard to tie together the vast foreground area, framing the mountain view to the west. This would give interest to the bottom of the horizon that many would encounter as they looked west out of all of the windows, distracting from the delivery trucks using the expansive asphalt roadways necessary for loading and receiving. Next, please. The crabapple orchard would be a wild meadow requiring little or no maintenance for the hospital staff. Today, Next, please. The landscape around the Alberta Children's Hospital is more traditional, using fenced areas, a good many fenced areas, and lacking the remarkable big and small moves that Cornelia was imagining. Next, please. Although I do believe that she would approve of the raised beds for the children to work in their gargantuan picnic table on the southwest corner. Sadly, we didn't develop the ACH work beyond the concept phase. We were dismissed by the client's project manager, a bullish character who Cornelia saw through in a matter of minutes and then lost a war of words with. The site design was subsequently taken over by friends of the PM, with only glimmers of the initial healing landscape vision surviving. It was heartbreaking, but next, please. As Susan Harrington notes in her book's introduction, Cornelia, quote, has always been very open in recounting both her successes and failures and the many stumbling blocks she's encountered. She believes her work is an evolving experiment, the art of the possible. Like so many who have spoken about her over the last months, I was moved in the brief, less than a year period of time I worked with Cornelia. I was moved by her rigor, the application of her humanity, her respect for the original ecologies of the site, the swing from heroic scale to tiny detail, her willingness to teach, her wicked stride, and as Susan Cohen observed in her Landscape Architecture magazine article lately, joy was Cornelia's default mode. I would agree. I would say she cared and she really persisted. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. That was a heartfelt presentation about Cornelia's work. Very, very nice. I would like to just pose a couple of questions to both you and Bill. Bill, you may want to turn your video back on as well. And we will also be taking questions from the Q&A, as Michael had mentioned. But I wanted to start and just kind of step back a little bit and think about defining the profession of landscape architecture as a whole. You've both revealed projects that touch upon elements of landscape architecture that aren't always naturally considered to be landscape architecture endeavors. And so when widening out that landscape architecture profession, Cornelia had often written and spoken about the role of landscape architecture and how students and those emerging in the process should cast a wider view of the profession. And even in 1956 and from then there forward, she would write about, landscape architecture needs to be more than parks and playgrounds and layouts. It needs to be a practice that works with architects and engineers on shopping centers, on housing, on roads, on schools, public buildings. She referred to landscape architecture as working with the living materials of the landscape. So I'm just curious, for starting from both of your vantage points, what role did Cornelia see for landscape architecture in the design process from both of your views?
Do you want me to give it a go, Bill?
Did you say you want me to go first?
Yeah. I'll take a swing at it and then you can sure. Annotate.
Yeah, please.
Okay. I thought Cornelia had a really very broad perspective. It was about us humans, but it also included included all the animals, the living things on the site, the state of the soil, the past history, the weather systems. I mean, there's so much at play in this, in the outside world, I guess, and depending on context, whether it's city or more rural setting, institutional or more commercial setting, she was just so rigorous in asking questions around what the story of the site was and what it could be. And I see a lot of parallels, frankly, with the work I'm doing with our Indigenous relatives now. It's super interesting.
Likewise, I think that Cornelia's layer layered understanding of both kind of culture and environment was really manifest in her work. She was very quick to identify really what a core problem was in terms of what role she could provide to, at least to a team that and in many cases she was an educator. She would provoke discussions and arguments, and in a way kind of serve as a kind of balancing force between, because the act of building is really a kind of violence on a site. Mm-hmm. And the act of city building is a violence on the environment. And I think she's a great example of how landscape architecture can operate at so many levels. I mean, she did many, being a kind of pioneer in roof garden design and green roof systems way back when with Robson Square, mm-hmm. and at least here in Vancouver, and the library garden that was finally realized a few years ago and open to the public. She experimented with technology. She was highly dedicated to the notion of kind of that there was an ethic around building and balancing the way in which we conceptualize space to include our brothers and sisters in the flora and fauna world. And I think to your question about what are landscape architects, I mean, they work with systems at a scale, a time, the evolution of as Jane mentioned, weather. They have to imagine things that don't yet exist or might not exist for 30 years because they understand how things will grow and how they will eventually look. So all the hospital, the descriptions of the hospital gardens that were, so tied to kind of a greater understanding of the long distance and the short distance of programming and of symbol. I've said to a lot of people recently, if I was to start again, that's probably where I would have started instead of architecture. And particularly now with challenges we're all facing, I think landscape architecture as a profession is just in its nascent stages of serving as a kind of a profession of stewardship over and at the risk of sounding too megalomaniac in this statement, but it's a profession that can really help the earth heal, I think.
Yeah. I'm going to throw in another question, and there's a question from an audience member about really asking for the ways that designers can effectively embrace or collaborate with landscape architects to achieve more holistic and forward-thinking work like Cornelia was thinking about, imagining. And I think we could tie this into a question around research. You both have mentioned the kind of research that Cornelia introduced for you, and also that you were working with on the projects, whether it's the ICMOS standards bill on the cemetery, and Jane, even going to the point of hiring a horticulture therapist as someone that we would consult in order to think about designs. So I'm just curious if you have any more that you'd like to elaborate on how her capacity for research on a project actually took place. What kinds of sources did she pull from in your experience?
Jane, would you like to go first on this, or would you like me to?
You go ahead, Bill, and I'll follow you.
I feel that design itself is a form of research. You don't always know all the answers or even the questions to ask until you start to really engage with the design problem, or the design. It's not always a problem, but it's the design challenge. And I think she understood that certain things come from certain parts of the brain. You know, the creative urge is as important as the analytical. And so, you know, in working with her, I always saw her moving back and forth between these two kind of things. She had a very strong formal and aesthetic set of rules as well that came from her, you know, from her history at Harvard and modernism and formalism. But on the other hand, her layered understanding of ecology and of kind of knitting back together ecosystems came from another whole source. So I just imagine her brain in a constant back and forth like this between these two very necessary sides, very necessary components of the design process.
There was an interesting part when you were talking, Bill, about which parts would be represented in the 21st century and which parts would remain in the 1800s, and how those decisions are made. And I'm just wondering, in talking about some of the standards for historic preservation, was there a consideration that one understands the rules of what one should do, and then you understand where you can create where to interlace the contemporary in with it? Would you say that's, yeah, or how did that relationship work? Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, we were moving in that direction anyways, but she armed us with the right document to march into meetings to say, you know, this is a universally held standard, and gave us, you know, the backbone to resist some of the suggestions that might have trivialized some of the design moves if we hadn't been on top of that. So she knew her rules, but she certainly knew when to break them as well, and when to bring in the more lateral side of the thought process.
So Jane, coming to you with this question of research, and also just really thinking about how one works with landscape architecture, if you wanted to add that to the question of research. But the idea of even considering a horticulture therapist is very intriguing to me. I don't know if you want to go further in that direction or something else that you have.
Well, working with the landscape architect is super interesting to me, because my team and I are now responsible at the University of Calgary for the development of the campus. And traditionally, we settlers have, you know, sort of airlifted buildings into place. And then, you know, and then identified a 1.5 meter skirt around the perimeter of the building that we give to the landscape architect to do something with. And that's always troubled me, that thinking, because and I learned I'm better able to articulate why it troubles me now that I work more tightly with a good many really talented landscape architects who are very instructive, and also the elders, because the first thing we do now on our land is we seek permission of the land before we start doing anything. And really seeking, that's in many ways, that's what Cornelia was doing, when she was asking us to do a deep dive into the research on the story of the land. And so before we started doing work, so I think the really healthy, you know, the successful projects are often the ones that are a true partnership between the built environment that will then enclose man, woman, and child, you know, and or animals in some cases, and the land itself where everyone else can move freely. It's a true partnership between the two of them. And we have all learned through this pandemic how important that outside world is to us, to our humanity, to our emotional and physical well-being. And so it's crazy it's taken us this long to recognize it, some of us culturally. So I think the horticultural therapist is another way of another way of broaching that conversation. You know, the bringing forward and bringing research, bringing evidence that you know, watching those trembling aspen leaves go is you know, as good as that pill coming out of the next jar. I mean, it isn't really, but it's doing something different for you than it's just all so valuable. So Yeah, I think the research takes different forms with Cornelia, and as Bill aptly put it, she worked both sides of the brain, and she started drawing. We started drawing and asking questions and measuring things and collecting lists and talking to people all simultaneously, and it's a super dynamic and interesting way to work.
Mm. We have about 5 minutes left, so if anyone has another question to throw in the Q&A, please do so, and I'll add that in. I wanted to add maybe an addendum to this question of research, which is really thinking about climate studies and climate change. And I think it's something that, Cornelia, you often find in the files research around climate conditions and climate studies. Jane, maybe in particular, you talked about the Alberta weather and the windswept weather. Is there any relationship to climate studies that you found in working with Cornelia?
Oh, absolutely. But I think it was sort of in her bloodstream. You know, and I look at the gorgeous gardens of the West Coast and the, you know, that she had the good fortune to work in, and some of the healing gardens and so on in California. We're all very envious of that. Coming here, it's an altogether different set of ingredients, I guess you could say, to the recipe. And she was very respectful of that. But she also looked forward. I mean, the climatic maps that you saw where I put up on the screen once, we'd look at those for today and look out 20 years and, you know, try to anticipate the future. You'd look at the past and look at the future and see where you could arrive. And as you say, anticipate, as only a landscape architect can translate for us, anticipate what things will do in the next 8 or 10 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and seeing that larger ecology also, I think, you know, thinking about how a design of healthcare and care for burn victims and, you know, mourning and grieving and all of those things can actually help to heal people more quickly. Recovery becomes quicker and it can lower healthcare costs. So and I think that was referenced in what you talked about today, but also I think she saw that larger picture of what the value of some of these designs could do. We have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to ask Bill, just if you would maybe elaborate more on this idea of the aesthetics and the relationship to the form or the function of design. You talked about her going between the left and the right brain very quickly. Is there anything that you want to add in terms of how she approached beauty or aesthetics in the sense of what made it important, what made it, without getting too caught up in the beauty, but why was beauty important to her, maybe? Bill, I don't know if you have a last word.
I think, oh, well, thank you. What an honor to have the last word. Jane has something else.
Oh, Jane, if you want to, Jane, go ahead. Yes, sorry.
No, go Bill.
That's such a great question. The way Cornelia lived, and I was fortunate enough, I'm very close to her family as well. And I visited many times their house where Cornelia's office always was, which was perched on the edge of Ravine right below UBC. And it was almost a framework for domestic life, but also for the observation of nature. But, and so it was very porous and with giant windows and things where she could, she and her husband Peter and their kids could take in the outside. I think she came from a lineage of design through the Bauhaus into Harvard that placed a lot of importance on the beauty of things and the abstraction of the abstraction and the reduction of things into their most essential, which was kind of one of the tenets of the time. And I think she carried those things through. But working with landscape, which is a dynamic and seasonal and changing thing, it gave her a way to explore that within a whole new realm that wasn't only about the static object, but I think she looked at it as part and parcel of the beauty of things. So some of her designs were very structured, seemingly structured. But if you were to spend time with them in, say, 4 different seasons, you would understand that she was playing with cycles and change. So like moving paintings, some of them.
Great. Well, I'm just looking at the time and I can see that it's 3 o'clock here, or I guess, yes, it's 3 o'clock. So I just wanted to say thank you to Jane, Amory, and Bill for this lovely conversation. It was a truly great way to spend a Sunday afternoon. Also, I want to thank everyone that tuned in, whether you're on live stream or watching Facebook. And I'm just going to invite Amory to have the last words.
Okay, thank you all for attending. Thank you, Michael. I didn't know I would say some last words, but the exhibition is closing today at the Art Gallery of Alberta. It has been there since April, so it's been a really exciting show to have up. It will be traveling next to Winnipeg, to the University of Manitoba, and then on to Ryerson University in Toronto. So we will keep you posted with ways that you can see the exhibition. We will be having a couple of 2 more Cornelius chats, as Michael mentioned at the beginning, and those will coincide with the 2 exhibitions. Thank you for attending, and Bill and Jane, thank you so much for the great conversation today. Thank you, Michael, too. Yeah.
Well, goodbye, everyone. Thank you so much.
Bye.